Good afternoon, and welcome to our Leaders in Liberal Arts Alumni Webinar Series. My name is Jason Broadwater. I'm our Assistant Dean here in the McAnulty College of Liberal Arts. Welcome today. Glad that you can join us. And for folks that will join us here in the future, thanks for viewing this on demand on our YouTube channel. As you can see, I'll be introducing our panel here shortly. We have a wonderful discussion today lined up regarding what makes a saint, an interdisciplinary conversation marking the canonization of John the 23rd and John Paul II. For those of you viewing at home, in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen, you will see a message window or a text box, something you'd almost see in a newspaper cartoon. If at any point you would like to ask a question, I will be monitoring the questions throughout the webinar. Feel free and submit your question, and I'll try and work it into the rotation this afternoon. Begin with some introductions. To my immediate right, Dr. Darlene Weaver is Director of the Center for the Catholic Intellectual Tradition and Associate Professor of Theology here at Duquesne. She previously served as the Director of the Theology Institute and Associate Professor of Theology at Villanova University and Visiting Assistant Professor at Georgetown University. Dr. Weaver is also the author of The Acting Person in Christian Moral Life, Self-Love and Christian Ethics, and co-editor and contributor to The Ethics, Embryo, Adoption, and the Catholic Tradition, Moral Arguments, Economic Reality, and Social Analysis. Welcome to Dr. Weaver. Dr. Jim Swindal is a professor of philosophy and the Dean of the McAnulty College and Graduate School of Liberal Arts here at Duquesne. He received his Master's in Theology from the Jesuit School of Theology at Berkeley and a PhD in philosophy from Boston College. He has published in areas of ethics, history of philosophy, and philosophy of religion, particularly Catholic philosophy and critical theory. At the present, he is working on a project on existentialism and Christianity. Welcome to Dean Swindal. After Dean Swindal, Dr. Maureen O'Brien is currently Associate Professor and Chair of the Department of Theology here at Duquesne University. She teaches a variety of courses at the undergraduate, master's, and PhD levels. She's published numerous articles in areas related to practical theology, religious education, and theological reflection for ministry, and is editor of a forthcoming collection, Emerging from the Vineyard, Essays by Lay Ecclesial Ministers. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Gerry Magill, was appointed to the Vernon F. Gallagher Chair of the Integration of Science, Theology, Philosophy, and Law here at Duquesne in the summer of 2007. He's a tenured professor in the university's Center for Healthcare Ethics, where he mentors students in his master's and doctoral programs in healthcare ethics. Dr. Magill has published 7 books, edited, co-edited, or co-authored. He recently completed a book manuscript on imagination and ethics and co-authored book on governance ethics for boards of directors in healthcare. Welcome to Dr. Magill. So we'll begin with a broad question. So whoever would like to jump in first on this one. But it's something that I think many Christians, many Catholics may think about. What makes a saint?
I thought something about this since I had a hand in preparing the question, the topic of the seminar. So here's what I would start with. I think what makes a saint is a person who has cultivated and been gifted with a real openness to God's presence in their lives. And so they maintain and develop that openness, but they respond to it in creative ways. So the experience of God, their openness, and their unique individual response that comes out of their own selfhood, I think are marks of a saint. And I think also, as I was thinking about this too, that you can't really be a saint by yourself. You can't you can say, I want to be a saint and I'm going to try to work to be a saint. But to be recognized as a saint, whether it's formally by the church or informally by people who just recognize the holiness, it's other people who do the recognizing. And so other people have to come to the sense of that, seeing in that person, here's someone with an extraordinary capacity for being attending to God's activity in their lives and responding to it. So that would be my start.
Anyone like to add?
I think one of the things that's interesting in what you said was the blend of personal agency, but also a recognition that sainthood as a particular way of conceptualizing holiness is the work of God and not the person. So the person responds, the person cooperates, the person endeavors to maintain some openness to the presence of God in his or her life. The person relies upon the community. So there are these pockets or varieties of agency that are exercised, but ultimately the holiness that would mark any of our lives is the work of God, and it's not our own work.
Yeah, I would just add to that I think some of our ordinary conceptions of saints might be a little bit off. I think we tend to think that a saint is somebody who really is giving up everything, is suffering a lot, is the one person who's most willing to do what he or she does not want for other people. I think, and that there's been writings in philosophy, which I'm a philosopher, on saints, and one of the things that really struck me is that it seems if you look at the writings of saints in their lives, they don't see themselves as really sacrificing a lot. They see themselves rather as just seeing the beauty of what they're doing and feeling happy doing that. And joy is much more descriptive of a saint than suffering, even though there is suffering involved. And the other thing is, so one is that sense of happiness and joy in the saint. The other is that saints would probably be the last person to make a big distinction between themselves and other people in terms of holiness. I think the saint can see holiness everywhere and doesn't see themselves as apart from everybody else in their being, in their life of holiness. And these are things that are seen in many faiths, not just Christianity, not just Catholicism, but saintly people have these, in this interpretation, these kind of two qualities.
And I would like to add to that what is a surprising side of the meaning of being a saint, because we're all called to being saints. Right. To be a saint is to be in heaven with God, so we're all called to be that. But the side of being a saint that is somewhat surprising and we need to take seriously is sin, weakness, fragility. That's who we are. God gives us grace. God will make us saintly. But what we are responsible for is our own fragility and our weakness, and we try to overcome that as best we can to let God shine in our lives. And John Henry Newman made an amazing observation about what it means to be a saint, although he himself said he would never be one because he was not that kind of guy. But he said it's about a commitment to truth and holiness. So indeed God's grace shines through our lives in terms of what we make of virtue and piety. But the concept of truth is really important, and this actually reflects into the two popes that we're talking about, Pope John the 23rd, the good pope, and Pope John Paul II, the Slavic pope, the first Slavic pope in history. That they were very much struggling with truth, indeed piety and holiness, and they were both very holy men. God's grace shone through their lives, through their frailty and their weaknesses. But very much they struggled with truth. First of all, John the 23rd in Vatican II to try and get a new insight into the truth that would lead to holiness. And then John Paul II through his long, very long career. Not the longest career of a pope ever, that was Pius IX, but still a very long career. He constantly struggled with truth to try and advance people's life, to say there is a difference between right and wrong. Truth yields insight about what is right, and let's call our lives as pilgrimages towards holiness as we try to struggle with truth. And the idea there basically is not that the truth is there and you either live with it or you don't, but it's there and you struggle for your entire life to get close to it.
So, knowing that Sunday is an important day, for many Catholics around the world, John the 23rd, John Paul II, for folks viewing this, what do we know about these men? Not only in terms of their papacy, but them as individuals. If anyone would like to comment on that.
John the 23rd, I think, is very much remembered as a lovable person. So I think as a person and as a saint in that way, people were drawn to him, and they seem to find in him this way of being, seeing him as so thoroughly himself and comfortable being himself. I think in some ways Pope Francis brings that to mind as well, that there's this sort of quality of genuineness that seemed to have been characteristic of his life, that involved humor, that involved personal warmth, that involved a career marked by some experiences of suffering. He was not considered to be one of the superstars of churchdom. He was somebody who in some ways was overlooked when he was elected to become Pope. It was widely perceived as an interim kind of papacy, that nobody expected much of him. And he accomplished great things in his short papacy. So just starting with those personal qualities, because I think that's part of what we talk about when we talk about saints too, is these are two men who led the church, who had a huge impact on the church in their various ways. But first of all, they were individuals that people were drawn to in terms of their own personalities. So.
Well, and over the course of John Paul II's papacy, of course, which was quite long, you got to see so many different facets of him. I remember as a young girl seeing images of him skiing. And of course, many people all over the world were deeply moved by his response to the assassination attempt, by his struggle with Parkinson's, and the way that he faced his death. And so, seeing him really at the kind of height of health and well-being, and watching him use his astute political gifts, and then witnessing his decline, and seeing other aspects of his personality really come to the fore, I think really allows us to see quite clearly whatever else might be said about particular aspects of his papacy or his theology or what have you, that this was a person who was very deeply a man of prayer, and whose life was, I think, really, really marked by this spirit of openness to grace that we've been talking about.
Well, another thing too would be that they were both very involved in the major events of the 20th century and were shaped by them enormously. They were not just pastors who spent time just in their own local diocese for most of their time. They were out in the world, and John the 23rd was in Bulgaria, Turkey, Islamic. He was in contact with Islamic cultures. He was in France after the war, in the rebuilding after World War II, then Patriarch of Venice. He'd been involved in World War I himself. So, if God prepares saints as He prepares each of us, there's a way in which those historical events shaped the kind of person that certainly he became. And same with Pope John Paul II, clearly shaped by World War II, by certainly the suffering of the Jews that he was certainly carried with him the rest of his life, and experiences of his own with close friendships with not just Jewish but many other faith traditions. So that's kind of, for me, that's inspirational. That you can go through life just kind of seeing your life not as something that's really being prepared, or you can take the events that you're part of and find yourself able to use that experience that you have. And I think that's what most of us were able to do.
Yeah, and I think that John the 23rd, although he was only a pope for a very short number of years, he truly had shocking value. He believed in a right good shock to the world, because he declared Vatican II. No one expected it. They thought, well, I mean, I think it was maybe the 10th ballot when he was elected. They couldn't decide who was going to be pope, so they elected John the 23rd, saying, well, he's old, he's obviously not healthy, he enjoyed a good meal. Maybe it won't last too long, this will give us a few years. Well, the Holy Spirit moves in very strange ways, apparently, because he woke up one morning and declared Vatican II. And what a wonderful example of God's providence through the lives of a leader of the church. Now, John Paul II had enormous courage in a slightly different way. He's well known for his courage because of growing up in the communist environment and fighting that. But actually, more significantly, is not the way he took on communism in terms of courage, but the way he took on Americanism. The capitalist culture in this continent that we share was anathema to John Paul II, and he took it on full square, and he was very courageous. So, for example, doctrines in the Catholic Church changed slowly, but he single-handedly changed one very important doctrine almost totally. Not quite 100-degree, full change, but a dramatic change, and that was in capital punishment. When he said, look, I understand that there's a culture around that wants to punish and be vindictive of prisoners who have committed heinous crimes like murder. But he says, here's the deal, we're changing our teaching on this, that no longer will we permit that to happen. The only condition that may be permitted would be in the event a nation would be unable to protect its citizens from the criminal who had perpetrated the crime. Now, it's very difficult to imagine a nation today that would not be able to have a jail or some kind of prison environment. So it was an enormously courageous and bold pope that would take on a culture around, say, capital punishment and say, no, you're wrong, you've got it completely upside down, I'm changing it. And in the same way he did it about the actual spirit of capitalism. This idea of trickle-down economics, let the moneyed class run the world and the poor class will eventually benefit from that. He just said that's wrong-headed, it's just flat wrong, we've got to change our mind on that. So a mark of enormous courage, and I think it's the courage of each of those popes as they made their quest, their pilgrimage through life, struggling with truth and seeking holiness. That's tremendous courage has made them stand out.
Just to add to that, I think that with the many years that John Paul II had as Pope, and with the energy and the intellect and the commitment to truth that he had, the body of writings that he produced was extensive and profound. And we sometimes, in popular culture, we tend to focus on the sexual teachings. We tend to focus on a piece of what a particular pope or the Vatican produces. And his work, as you say, on capitalism, critique of capitalism as well as communism, his document on work, on the dignity of human work, which is just profound. And in general, his social teachings were very, very significant and well developed over a long period. That John the 23rd, I think, had some similar commitments, and he wrote a beautiful letter on peace on earth. And he was very concerned about the state of the world, but he didn't have the number of years, and things worked out in a different way with him. But I do think John Paul II, that's one of his most important legacies.
So, staying in that vein, I'd like to touch on Pope Francis, and I will here in a sec. One of the questions that came in leading up to our webinar today, this is from Carol Caruso Carruthers, an arts grad from 1971, and she writes, so how does one live out the universal call to holiness in the setting of a secular world? I have found nor a good way to respond to both priorities, especially when they seem mutually contradictory, touching upon kind of what you're getting at, Gerry, about capitalism and the value and things we put in material goods, money, here in the United States. So obviously a broader question than necessarily any the two popes that we're talking about today. But if anyone would like to comment on that.
that is like the question. But again, these popes lived in the world. They were in world events that were very, very secular in nature. But to go back a little bit to church teaching, both of these popes defended the right to private property. That we live in a world where there are nation states and there's issues of justice, and we can't just live as if we're not living in a world that's very complex and economic realities are there. So the secular and the sacred are pretty intertwined, not only in the lives of these two men, but also in what they wrote. And both of them were very interested in the problem of communism, which had challenged the right to private property, which is ironically kind of a religious impulse that the communists had, and yet both of their writings clearly indicate that we have to live in a world that's again economic, secular, political, but also infuse it with our faith.
I take a characteristically Catholic both and approach to that question. We are both called to embrace and enter into the particular circumstances of our lives, the particular flaws with which we struggle, the particular opportunities that are presented to us, the particular situations in which we find ourselves complicit, the historical events that shape them. So holiness doesn't lie in any kind of escape from those things. And especially now that we're in the Easter season, one of the most powerful reminders of that is just to meditate on the fact that the resurrected body of Christ still bears the wounds of the crucifixion. The way down and the way up are the same. That said, so that there's one side of the equation. Holiness does require a certain degree of countercultural living, and that means we need to, I think, be committed to borrow from Pope Francis, to go walk among others who are different from us, to smell like the streets, to listen to voices from the margins, to open ourselves to be challenged by those who can present a different perspective, who can awaken us to our complacency or our unacknowledged privilege or complicity and so on. It is a challenge to cultivate that kind of a life, particularly when you live in a first world context like ours. And yet, as I said, simply imagining that holiness requires some big escape from the circumstances of your life would, I think, be mistaken and at odds with the incarnation.
So you mentioned Pope Francis.
You can thank me later.
I was going to say the world's most popular man right now. So what is Pope Francis saying about the joint canonization of his two predecessors?
Well, he's definitely showing himself to be politically astute, because although John the 23rd had been, his canonization process had been opened by Paul VI, and John Paul II had beatified him, it didn't really look as though it was going very far, because they didn't quite have the technical number of miracles that they seek. And there may not have been a drive to have canonized him just now, except for one very unusual piece, and that is When Francis became Pope, there was a strong movement to have John Paul II canonised. Now, as we talked earlier about holiness, part of being holy is that we are also very fragile. And the debate over the canonization of John Paul II is very fragmented. In other words, had the Pope Francis, gone ahead and just canonized John Paul II, it could have created a huge cultural war within Catholicism of those who are for him and those who are against him. Those who are for John Paul II really appreciate all that we've been talking about him. But we cannot underestimate the number of people who would be opposed to the Pope, the canonization of Pope John Paul II, because of the mistakes that he made, especially over child abuse. They are very serious problems. They cannot go away and they cannot be buried. And he was unable to do anything systemic in the church that would really make a major difference. People will often associate the tragedy of child abuse as a failure of his leadership of being Pope over that long period of time. So we cannot underestimate that. So if John the 23rd was the good Pope, and if John Paul II was the Slavic Pope, then maybe Francis is going to be poor Francis, poor Pope Francis, not just because of the poverty of Saint Francis, but the poor guy's faced with an impossible choice. Do I canonize John the 23rd and have a war, or do I not and still have a war? So he threaded a very difficult needle by saying, I'm going to canonize John the 23rd, but I'm going to also canonize his mentor, Pope John. I'm going to canonize John Paul II, but I'm also going to canonize his mentor, Pope John the 23rd, because John Paul II, his entire papacy, was about implementing Vatican II that had been opened by John the 23rd. And in that way, by doing that, he showed a remarkable nimbleness as a pope in charge of a very complicated church, so that he is able to give tremendous leadership by saying these are two good and holy men from whom we can learn a lot. But if you want to look at the dark side in each, feel free, because there's plenty of sin there. And if you're going to throw that stone, first look at yourself. Remember the biblical story, who will throw the first stone? So he was very sensitive to the difficulty that he was encountering. It was a political difficulty within the Catholic Church, and I think it just extraordinarily astute the way he resolved it by saying we're going to canonize both together.
Yeah, and I would only add to that, I think that's a very good analysis of what he's trying to do in this, that even the idea of popes canonizing popes is a relatively new trend, or canonizing popes to the degree that they've been canonized in the last few years. And so even there's a sense in which, there has to be a lot of pastoral care and good political judgment made in the way that Pope Francis does this, because if you're canonizing your own direct predecessors, does it then become all this automatic kind of pattern that, every pope should be canonized and it's only a matter of time? And what does that say about holiness in the church? It just bears reflection, I think, in an ongoing way.
So I guess that kind of leads into legacy of both John the 23rd and John Paul II. How would you categorize their legacies as Pope or as individuals?
There's a kind of odd reality that it may be that the Pope who was there for a short number of years has a greater legacy. Because the idea of calling a Vatican Council Vatican II is just such a big thing in the history of the Church. But this council achieved an extraordinary amount. I mean, look at the previous council, Vatican I in 1870. It had only 2 documents, one of them infallibility and the other one I can't remember. But that was obviously not that important if I can't remember. But Vatican II, you can just go through them. They just roll off. They're part of the modern church. It has shaped not just our generation, but will shape the history of Christianity forever. But none of those documents of Vatican II were published by John the 23rd. He died in 1963. They all came from Paul VI. But he, John the 23rd, gets the credit for opening the council, for the aggiornamento, the opening of the windows and the fresh air upon the church. Now, John Paul II had a long career, as we've said, and published a lot of magnificent, really moving and highly insightful documents. But there's been a lot of popes in the history of Christianity who have published a lot of interesting and exciting encyclicals. And like the other one of Vatican I, I can't remember. And maybe 40 years from now, folk will say, no, I don't remember those. So I suspect that as time goes on, it's going to be difficult from a legacy point of view to outweigh Vatican II. That's an enormous legacy for a pope of just a few years. And John Paul II, although he's very big in our mind now and has a lot of publications through his encyclicals because we have lived for the past 25, 30 years with him, down the ages that may pass. That may actually not have the same impact as the short-living good Pope John the 23rd. It will be interesting to see how history judges that.
I think a legacy we haven't directly talked about so far of both of them is engagement in the modern world in their own distinctive ways. And so for John the 23rd, that clear conviction he had that the church needed to be updated and it needed to throw open the windows and breathe the air of the world, of the cultures in which we find ourselves today. And becoming, because of the state of communication and technology at that point, the church becoming a kind of part of popular consciousness in a new way. That during the Vatican Council, there were people writing about it constantly, journalists, TV coverage, the world, whether you were Catholic or not, there was a high awareness. There's something important going on here. And so John, in beginning that kind of modern visibility of the church, and John Paul II with his magnetic personality, with his travels all over the world, with his World Youth Days, with the kind of savvy he brought to the public symbolic gestures he made, the liturgies he celebrated, etc. So I think that certainly part of the language of Vatican II was an awareness of modern technology, a more global and interconnected world. And I think both the popes and these both popes in their own ways fostered and forwarded that engagement that has stayed as a lasting legacy.
Yeah, and I mean, it's unquestionable that the modern world is what has gotten folded into so much of what both of these folks were doing. But I am struck by the fact that John XXIII had some very good reasons for calling the Vatican Council, and modern Magister, for example, 1961, reads just like a Vatican document. Pacem in Terris reads just like a Vatican II document, even though they predated. So I think there was a lot more kind of catching up to some of the things that he already pretty well had in mind by the time the council really got going. So that's clearly his legacy. There's no question. As far as Pope John Paul II, I would like to speak about one legacy of his, and that's kind of relevant to us here, and that's with regard to higher education. Particularly with Fides et Ratio and Ex Corde Ecclesiae. These are very complex encyclicals, and a lot of people will attribute this to his own educational background as a philosopher, and that certainly did shape it. But I think for us, we had a pope that was able to translate kind of the modern world's understanding, both of Christianity and world faith, Abrahamic faith, and the whole phenomenon of higher education, and could put those together. And in Fides et Ratio, where he speaks of really the Socratic phenomena of knowing thyself, and how philosophy is not just kind of an accidental, kind of a nice thing that you can have, but it's fundamental to the human person to ask these questions about one's self-knowledge and one's knowledge of God. To me, it gives a real impetus to not just anybody who's a person of faith, but particularly to the academic enterprise. It seems most of the time to disregard issues of faith. I mean, there's just too much else that we have to know about. And yet we had someone that could really unite those in a clear way. Acts Corde Ecclesiae is was more the structural piece of that, and much more complex. But I think the inspiration of someone who wants to see where academics and one's faith and religious commitment come together is a real legacy. Pope John Paul II.
There is perhaps another legacy that's about to break on the shores of both of these popes. And Francis, I think, is highly attentive to this emerging legacy that will likely be his, but I don't think he wants to claim it. I think he wants it to move to the names of these two popes, the upcoming saints. And that is the concept of evangelization. However we want to parse who was responsible for the past 50 years of the Church, there is no doubt that the practice of the faith has diminished, at least in an old-fashioned sense of going to church every Sunday, going to confession every Saturday. The practice of Catholicism, as we knew it, changed. Now, there's a big debate about why that was the case. Was that because of Vatican II? Should Vatican II have been tighter or stricter or whatever? However you want to explain it, it is a fact. And it is curious that both popes, John the 23rd and John Paul II, were attentive to the idea of evangelizing in many ways. John the 23rd did it through adjournamento. Let's update the church to evangelize the world. John the 23rd was much more charismatic, personally charismatic about that. By goodness, could he bring in a crowd. Those big stadiums full of young kids, But the problem was, oftentimes they would go away and forget about the evangelical moment. It was nice to be there in a football stadium with the Pope. And Francis seems to be highly attuned to the need to bring people back in gently to the practice of the faith. And the word that he is using, in addition to evangelization, that's his strategy, so to speak, but the word he's using to bring people back is mercy. We've got truth in our church. We have doctrine. We seek piety and we promote holiness. But we are not yet saints. All of us are extraordinarily fragile and weak. So we need to be compassionate and merciful with each other. And because you are a sinner, then I'm a sinner too. Because you are frail and not quite inconsistent with church teaching, I can tell you, I'm the Pope, I'm there too. I know where my frailties are. And Francis seems to be saying, let's now have the adjournamento of Vatican II, or have the charismatic evangelical movement of John Paul II in a different language. Let us now welcome people, not in terms of a stick to come into the church, but let's welcome them, not even with a carrot, in terms of enticing them. Let's be humble about it. Let's just say, yeah, we are all weak people, and God is on the side of all of us. And let's gather and share our weaknesses in God's Eucharist to bring holiness among us. And I think that legacy that those two popes had in terms of evangelizing the world is now coming forward in a very different way with Pope Francis, his emphasis on mercy and gentleness and poverty.
So the bridge between Francis and John Paul II was Benedict, a name we haven't mentioned thus far. I haven't seen or heard, I don't know if you have, in terms of any thought or sort of where he stands in all of this. A retired pope, right? Sort of a rare occurrence. So I don't know if anyone would like to comment.
Well, I'll recommend the current Atlantic magazine has a very interesting piece by Paul Ellie on Benedict, and so I think that's one to go to read as far as what is this unique experience. But he, the sense is he made clearly a very conscious decision that he would resign, and that whatever his own inner feelings at this point about what Francis is doing, he is leaving the stage to Francis. So there's something quite admirable to me about that, about realizing that he's going to probably live a number of years with the presence of this new pope and That's something he chose. So that not just about Benedict, but thinking about popes and saints in general. Your spirituality, I think, is so important to how you are saintly in these kinds of circumstances. So there are always unintended consequences. So Benedict could make a choice to resign. Doesn't know what'll follow from that. Didn't know what his successor would be like. No idea. And so to live now, to orient oneself in terms of one's spirituality to how am I going to continue to stay open to God's presence in my life and in the circumstances where I now find myself, live faithfully. And for him, I would wager it's going to be continuing to cultivate his enormous gifts as a theologian, to continue to study, to continue to produce writings, and to be a man of prayer. That's where all signs are pointing, I guess, at this point.
Sure.
It's curious to think, though, that when we're talking about what is the legacy of a pope, and as I said, with John the 23rd, the short-living pope, you've got Vatican II, the long-living pope might not get so much, although he had a lot more to offer. We think back to Pius IX, the longest-serving pope ever. How many encyclicals of Pius IX do we remember? So that's the difficulty John Paul II has. But curiously, Benedict XVI, he will be forever remembered. Why? He resigned. Very short-living pope again, he will be forever remembered. And what's so good about that is the joy it brings the church in terms of, yes, we can do this. This opens the windows and gives us a freedom of movement. It creates a possible headache because we always assume that he would die before the current pope, but Francis could die first. And then you're left with the delightful theological question, can you ask a pope to come out of retirement? But it showed enormous, again, the courage of the other popes we talked about earlier, for him to say, I'm going to resign. Why? That's the critical question. Not that he did it, but why? Because he saw his own frailty, that he was no longer capable of leading a church that he considered, he knew to be in crisis, he knew the needs were gargantuan, and he saw he could not do it. And he took God's providence seriously in prayer, in his own holiness, his call to piety, by saying, I'm happy now to leave this to someone else. That's quite remarkable. I never thought I'd see that in my life. So Benedict certainly is going to be up there for a long time, I think, because of that courageous decision.
Sure. Darlene, too, I don't know if you want to add a last word about Benedict.
Yeah, I would just say that would be the issue of continuity. That Pope Benedict was very much involved in Vatican II, and so was Pope John Paul II. Was a theologian and wrote like a theologian, taught like a theologian to a large extent. But I think part of this, if we could go back even to the sanctity, what's holiness and sainthood to begin with, is that you see yourself as part of, but also beholden to, in a certain way, something that's much larger than you are. And that it's a trust that you have, that you can live your life knowing that there's something if you're dedicated to it, that carries so much of what you're doing. And I think that's what really can kind of bring this down to our lives as just people in the world, where the world is a big stage, and sometimes we see all of us rather insignificant, filled with doubts and failures and joys. But maybe that there's something in that where I think, for me, the similarities among popes and among people of holiness is probably greater than the differences. And that if we're marking out two of these popes for this particular sainthood, that is significant, but they're only holy because it's something much greater than them that everyone participates in. And but it will be interesting to see how history looks at Pope Benedict as it already is beginning here in terms of that. But certainly, again, in terms of, if I can say one more quick thing here about academics, I mean, the kinds of, to have a pope with that kind of intellectual acuity in terms of biblical theology, that said a lot about his papacy as well. So he'll be marked by a number of things as time goes on.
So for those viewing at home and at a desk or a computer, if you do have any questions, the bottom right-hand side of your screen, you'll see a text box. Feel free and submit a question. We'll try and incorporate it here in our closing minutes. So why are saints important in Catholic tradition and for us today?
Well, there's nothing uncommon about the notion of a community sort of collectively upholding some of its members as exemplars of its central commitments and experiences, as sort of personifications in a special way of, its own most central identity conferring commitments. So, in that sense, what the Catholic Church is doing, or say the Eastern Orthodox, which also has canonization, processes, anthropologically speaking, has distinctive characteristics, but is not in and of itself a phenomenon. It's all that remarkable. We human beings may very well have these sorts of needs to distinguish members who are aspirational models for us. Having said that, though, I think this goes back to Jim's earlier mention of some debate, particularly in philosophy, about the very notion of sainthood, and the point that Gerry's made a couple times about human fragility and so on. I think that this canonization is really just an important opportunity to try to cleave what I think in popular imagination an identification we too often make to our detriment, which is to unite holiness and a kind of moral perfection with each other. And it's really an important moment to affirm the fact that that conceptions of sainthood that we might have, that saints at every waking moment of the day have their thoughts elevated onto something lofty and transcendent, or that they're really dour, and who would ever want them at the Thanksgiving table with you because they'd be such a downer, or things like that, and that their lives are characterized by this sort of unyielding, unrelenting, sort of stingy moral perfectionism, or something I think would be really deeply problematic. Was it Susan Wolf who wrote the essay called Moral Saints? And she presents this picture of sainthood as really dour and offers a moral critique of the very idea of sainthood, and says, I think on moral grounds we need to reject this idea because this is not a human life that would be worth living. And the great thing, of course, is that people who are a little more familiar with the actual lives and personalities of some saints respond and called into question that conception of sainthood. And you yourself noted that saints are not perfect human beings. Their lives are marked by sin and by personal flaws and failures and all sorts of shortcomings. Their lives are also by and large marked with joy, with generosity, with abundance, with huge differences in personalities and charisms and so on. And I think that kind of democratization of holiness is extremely important as a reminder that at Vatican II, the call to holiness is truly a universal call to holiness. And what you have is the abolition of a kind of two-level ethic where holiness is something reserved for those who are consecrated or ordained, and instead an affirmation that this is something that we're all called to participate in.
When I was to be confirmed, I don't know, 6th grade, I guess it was for me, we had to choose a saint's name for our confirmation name. So my choice was Therese de Lisieux, and a holy young woman, Carmelite nun, died at the age of 24, I think, of tuberculosis, and lived her life very much within the confines of a rather small existence in a small place within the convent. And I think that I, in part, identified with her because her spirituality was the little way. It was the sense that, well, anybody can follow this little way. I can do it, you could do it. And so when you think about why, the question why we need saints, on the one hand, for me, it was, I think, that was important to say, it's not this person who's totally removed from my experience. It's someone whose life I can emulate. On the other hand, and I think as I've gotten older, I've also realized that in my sense, in our world today, we need saints who challenge us beyond the smaller confines of whether it's our lives, our homes, our families, our jobs. So your previous questioner about how we live this today, I think we need saints today who show us the power of a life that really dramatically changes in outward service beyond our own personal concerns. And so my contemporary saint, although he's not canonized, one of them would be Oscar Romero, the Archbishop of El Salvador, who was minding his own business as a conservative bishop and was made archbishop and converted to the poor and was assassinated because of his prophetic witness. And that's really scary to me. And at the same time, I think we need saints to draw us beyond what's familiar to us.
So as we wrap up, have you each name a favorite saint or a saint that you may admire, look up to, have the fondness for? I know Maureen. Yeah. So nice segue there.
I'm a weak spots for St. Paul and St. Augustine because of the brilliant minds at work and the fact that both of them write about their experience of a living God in ways that are so psychologically complex and nuanced. And I'm also quite a fan of Teresa of Avila, doctor of the church, woman appealing to her experiences at a time where she had some very tricky political terrain to navigate because, of course, the perspectives of women were not widely credited or acknowledged, and she used her particular skills and assets really quite effectively. And, yeah, she's a favorite.
For me, it'd be hard to kind of narrow it down, but if I could say one or two, would be St. Edith Stein now, who, as a philosopher, is someone who also went through the horrific events of the 20th century, was remarkable in her short life. But another saint would be St. Ignatius of Loyola, who I mentioned because I think we have to acknowledge that Pope Francis, as much as we're not talking about him specifically today, but certainly St. Ignatius of Loyola continues to have a huge influence on his life, and I can see the kind of the openness to the world, the willingness to engage well beyond the confines of Catholicism. The Jesuits were the ones that engaged with the reform of the church, reformers. That engagement was written there, and also St. Ignatius was well steeped in the scholastic tradition, again, the philosophical tradition of scholasticism that was part of his education. St. Ignatius of Loyola, going through his kind of conversion experience. So, anyway, those are just a couple of reflections.
Well, I have two saints, both of them men. One Aquinas, St. Thomas Aquinas, whose commitment to truth and holiness shaped the Catholic Church, the Christian Church, Christianity for 1,000 years. He blended them beautifully together, not making truth a tyranny, but making it an ideal that we have a pilgrimage towards, making holiness the definition of that quest, that we are frail and weak people. And he mentored, in many ways, Pope John the 23rd. He was a scholastic, and he loved Aquinas' thought. And then as I was thinking, as I was coming out today, I had to put on a slightly larger size of pants because of a wonderful birthday meal the other night there for my wife. And I thought, well, actually, St. Thomas Aquinas and Pope John the 23rd, they were kind of men who liked a good meal. So there's nothing wrong in that either.
Well said. Well said. That draws us to a close. My thanks to Dr. McGill, Dr. O'Brien, Dr. Swindal, and Dr. Weaver for today's discussion about future saints, John the 23rd and John the 2nd. This does conclude our webinar series for this academic year. We will resume the Leaders in Liberal Arts webinar series starting this fall, most likely in September. If you do have ideas for future webinars that you would like to see us potentially implement, you may contact me directly at broadwaterj@duq.edu. You can also find that on the Duquesne website as well. On behalf of the Dean's Office of the McAnulty College of Liberal Arts, thank you for watching, and we'll see you again in the fall.